One of the more peculiar Star Wars games I've ever played on this channel has to be the vehicular combat game called Star Wars Demolition. Released first on December 13th in the year 2000 for the Sony PlayStation, and then on November 20th for the Sega Dreamcast, Star Wars Demolition was developed by a smaller studio called Lux of Flux based in Santa Monica. While this isn't the only vehicle-based Star Wars game from this time period, as it joined the ranks of various other excellent titles like Rogue Squadron and Battle for Naboo, it is certainly the strangest. And also, strangely enough, features the edgiest marketing campaign I've ever seen in a Star Wars game. I don't think I've ever seen a Star Wars game try so hard to make it clear that this is a T for Teen title. Just look at the posters for this thing. They managed to use the word carnage twice on the same poster after saturating it in as much red and as many explosions as they could manage without the poster becoming an explosion itself. And the weird edginess doesn't end there, as nearly every cutscene in the game features prominent screen time of the scantily clad Twi'lek slaves seen in Episode 6. Don't get me wrong, I don't hate the edge appeal of the game. In fact, I tend to love games the edgier they are. Not to mention, some of the in-game victory cutscenes look straight out of a TikTok edit. This game is insane. As mentioned before, Demolition only ever released for the Dreamcast and the PS1, which is, of course, the version that we're looking at here today. The game doesn't have much of a plot to speak of, but there is a thin veneer of a storyline offered up to give the player a reason why they're flying around a battlefield fighting an AAT, a speeder, and a Rancor at the same time. Demolition takes place directly before the events of Return of the Jedi, and as such, features a few notable characters from the film, although not quite in the same way as you may expect to find them. The Empire has recently placed a total ban on pod racing galaxy-wide, which, I mean, we know how petty Anakin can be. I find it more than reasonable that the second he randomly remembered pod racing one day after becoming Vader, he moved to ban it out of spite. In light of this, Jabba has been forced to find a new adrenaline-fueled, dangerous sport to watch and bet on. And so, he has devised this, his new demolition sport. Various vehicles ride into an arena and face each other down to see who rides away in one piece. This is the extent of the game's attempt at a story or to fit itself into the lore. Although it does bother to do that much, the original Star Wars continuity manager at LucasArts pre-Disney, Leland Chee, did state that Star Wars Demolition was not a recognized part of the expanded universe. Which means we've got another relatively non-canon Star Wars game released on this platform, which kind of shows how experimental LucasArts was really trying to be with their licensing at the time. They wanted Star Wars in as many forms as possible, in as many places as possible, and this resulted in varying degrees of quality, as we've already seen so far in this video. Although this game isn't what I'd call good, it's not very bad either. Demolition has 4 different modes available to frame the various vehicular death matches that players will be partaking in. These modes are called Battle, Tournament, High Stakes, and Hunt a Droid. Between these 4 modes, the majority of the game's content will be found in just one, while the other 3 are shallower in their execution. The first mode, simply called Battle, is a stripping down of format in order to enjoy the game at its base level. You select what vehicle you would like to control, and then select the vehicles of your 4 opponents, so you can customize the match to your liking. This is the quintessential 2-player mode as well, so if you've got a friend over, then they can select their vehicle of choice here too. I can actually picture in my head 2 young siblings opening up a present on Christmas morning to see Star Wars Demolition, only to throw it in their PlayStation and select the vehicles they wanted to play as. Lastly, the player selects what map they would like to play on. I'll get to that in a minute. Battle mode is this game in its purest state, without context or cause, just 5 vehicles fighting to the death for victory. That said, the other 3 modes try to be a bit more interesting content-wise. High Stakes mode, for instance, adds a credit aspect to your battles where you're shown odds of victory and place a bet until you either win 10,000 credits or lose it all. This is an interesting enough idea, but just fails to actually deliver a unique enough experience to justify its existence. Hunt a Droid is a bit more fun, letting you pick a vehicle and a map and then just scour the map, destroying as many probe droids as you can until the timer runs out. I actually liked this one. I could see myself playing something like this as a kid back then. Which brings us to the sort of main game mode here called Tournament. In this mode, the player will select a character of his or her choice and fight through 4 increasingly difficult matches, each one adding an additional opponent into the fray to be accounted for. So your first match is a 1v1, then your second match adds in another opponent, and your third another until your fourth match has all 5 vehicles on the map at once fighting it out. These are not team-based matches and are technically supposed to be free-for-all total mayhem, chaos, and carnage. Right? Right? Well, that's how it works on paper, but in execution, these matches are absolutely team-based and end up just being you versus the enemy AI. At first when I was playing, I thought that it just felt like the enemy AI was ignoring each other and ganging up on me, but then I decided to put it to the test when I had gotten frustrated with losing one particularly difficult level. I started avoiding all of the enemies to the best of my ability, hoping to just wait it out a little bit until my opponents took each other out or at least dealt out some damage to one another. After dodging any confrontation for around 5 minutes, I decided to go back into it and pick a fight, only to find every single one of my opponents at 100% health and ammunition. They do appear to fight each other, by the way. They'll fire off a few lasers and sort of chase each other around, but they do not in actuality ever seem to damage each other. Throughout these levels, the player is allotted a certain number of credits to spend, which are to be used on refilling your shields and your ammunition during the matches. When you run out of these credits, it's game over, and you're even treated to a unique cutscene, which I'll talk about here shortly. It's important to save as many of these credits as you can, however, and keep making more by ramming, shooting, and demolishing your opponents, because if you win the tournament mode with over 10,000 credits left, you'll unlock a special new playable character depending on who you won with, which you're going to want to do since there are some fun vehicles hidden behind these unlocks. Now it's time for me to do what I do and talk about who these characters are. Each character comes with one fully animated CGI cutscene for you if you win the tournament mode, and another for if you lose, and some of these are pretty great. The developers actually created a few different original characters specifically for this game, the first of which is our sort of protagonist, if there was such a thing in this game. Wade Vox is a Force-sensitive smuggler born on Alderaan before he found himself caught up in Jabba's Demolition games. Wade was born into a family of wealthy merchants whom he worked for as he aged into adulthood and flourished in a fairly happy and fulfilled life. That is, until one day he was piloting a cargo transport to Corellia for his father's company, and the Empire randomly decided to blow up his homeworld. So you can imagine how devastating that would have been. One day you work with your father for a successful merchant company, and the next day all of your friends, family, and resources are gone like they were never there in the first place. So now he had nothing left to his name but the ship he was currently flying, and as such fell into the only option he really had: making smuggling runs for the Hutts, Jabba the Hutt in this case. As you can imagine, this eventually led him to being coerced into competing in Jabba's Demolition games. Wade pilots an X-34 Landspeeder, which is surprisingly one of the more effective vehicles in the game, and he even has some force abilities that he uses to his advantage while piloting this vehicle, an idea that would be reused in Jedi Starfighter several years later. A fun fact is that the speeder we pilot in this game is the very same one that Luke had driven in Episode 4 before selling it for credits. Wade even bought it from the same merchant in Mos Eisley. Upon winning the tournament, we even see him build his own lightsaber. All in all, Wade is an interesting enough character, but since he was created as an original character for this game specifically, he isn't canon to the expanded universe and does not go on to appear in any other Star Wars media. Then of course you've got the poster child of the game, Boba Fett. I mean, what do I really even need to say about this one? He's Boba Fett. You know who he is and what he's about. He doesn't even bother to bring a vehicle either, he just flies around on his jetpack the whole time. It's honestly super hardcore. I did notice he's pretty hard to get the hang of playing with, but not nearly as much as some of the other less notable characters are. Of course, if he loses the tournament, then Jabba straight up tries to kill him. Up next is General Otto, another original character made up for Star Wars Demolition, but unlike Wade Vox, did go on to appear in other Star Wars media. Well, really only one thing, that being the old MMO Star Wars Galaxies. Otto served as a general in the Empire, which was an impressive feat given that he was seen widely as incompetent by his peers and fellow officers. This incompetence nearly led him to execution at Vader's hands, if not for the intervention of one of his friends. Before his career with the Empire was over, Otto would end up stealing an Imperial AT-ST and using it to enter Jabba's Demolition games in hopes of winning enough credits to buy a high-rise apartment on Cloud City where he would live out the rest of his life in peace and bliss. If Otto fails, however, he does end up being caught and turned into Vader for execution. Not a pretty ending, that's for sure. It is, however, the most likely one if you're playing as Otto because he is arguably the worst character in the game. The AT-ST is not fast nor agile, and it's too tall to the point where enemies just run into your legs and keep shooting you while you can't shoot back. And even worse, since you can't back up in this game, you have to just try and move around them. It's really annoying and makes him one of the hardest characters to play. Then we've got Tia and Gia, a pair of twin sisters born on the planet of Bestine 4 who ended up joining the rebellion as pilots. Coincidentally, both of them were exceptional pilots at that. One of their weaknesses, however, was their infatuation with the roguish smuggler Han Solo, a man whom they had previously encountered and fallen for. Upon hearing about his capture at the hands of Jabba the Hutt, the twins made up their mind to take a snowspeeder and go to Tatooine in order to free him. They were captured while attempting this, however, and wound up serving as slave girls for Jabba instead. Never one to miss a good opportunity, Jabba convinced the sisters to compete in his Demolition games after learning of their careers as rebel pilots and even letting them use the snowspeeder they had stolen to get there. He did so with the promise of their freedom upon winning the tournament. If you lose, you see a cutscene showing that they remain his slaves until his demise shortly thereafter at the hands of Leia. If you win, you instead see that they remain slaves in spite of their victory upon Jabba going back on his promise and end up having to be rescued by Leia Organa during her infiltration of Jabba's palace to rescue Han. One of the more colorful characters to appear in the game is Aurra Sing, a character who not only appears in The Phantom Menace for a brief moment, but also has a deep and extensive lore both in the expanded universe and the Disney canon, even appearing in several episodes of the Clone Wars animated series. Because of that, it's pretty difficult to give a lore account of her in this video because she has two very different lores depending on which continuity you look at. And if we look at the EU version, which of course I would, it's far too lengthy to talk about here. So I'll sum it up by saying this. Aurra Sing was a dropout from the Jedi Order long before even the events of the Phantom Menace, and she dropped out of the temple after becoming dissuaded with their ways in favor of becoming a bounty hunter/assassin. Eventually, she took to specializing in contracts hunting potential Force sensitives, which is what placed her at Jabba's Demolition games. She's here looking for a potential Force sensitive that she's been hired to kill, that being the aforementioned Wade Vox. So honestly, she's kind of like the main antagonist, but again, there really isn't such a thing in this game. I did have an action figure of her as a kid though, among a dozen or more others. Then we've got Quagga, or Quagga, a Wookiee engineer who drives an old AAT relic from the Clone Wars. It's really cool to have this vehicle in the game, but choosing to make its pilot a Wookiee is just so amusing to me for some reason. Quagga spent several years as a slave to an Imperial engineer until that engineer bought his freedom and turned him loose to pursue his dream of owning his own repair shop. To that end, Quagga sought to disappear on Tatooine, where he set up a small shop just outside of Anchorhead. However, due to his remote location, expensive methods, and the intense competition from the local Jawas, Quagga found himself so short on credits that he entered himself into Jabba's Demolition games and hoped to win enough credits to move his business to the center of Mos Eisley. If Quagga loses the games, however, his fate winds up becoming a grim similarity to his life before gaining freedom. The AAT doesn't control super well either, but it's a fun little vehicle to play with. Quagga is a neat addition to the game, but I don't imagine anyone was ever maining him due to there being better options available. I can't say much about this character because he's literally just Lando. He's called Tamtel Screech, but he's actually just Lando in disguise. The given reason for him being here is to earn Jabba's trust by participating in the Demolition games where he drives a Bantha II cargo skiff. The skiff is really hard to control and I didn't really like using it. As for Tamtel, there's a non-canon story about the original Tamtel, but so far as any recognized lore goes, it's only really known as Lando's alias during the events of Han's rescue from Jabba. Pugwis, on the other hand, is another original character created for this game, and not only is he a Dug born on Malastare, but he's also the grandson of young Anakin's old rival, Sebulba. Pugwis had a knack for getting himself into trouble, eventually leading him to be disqualified from pod racing altogether, which meant that when the sport became outlawed and Jabba opened up his Demolition games, Pugwis was all in. It was Pugwis's tendency towards violence that inspired Jabba to create the Demolition games in the first place, and as such, Pugwis was the first contestant Jabba invited. However, after a falling out with the Hutt, Pugwis was tied to his own pod racer and flown over the Sarlacc pit where he was eaten alive. Speaking of his pod racer, it's one of the more fun vehicles of the game in my opinion. Flying through the tracks and a pod racer were some of the more entertaining moments I had while playing the game. The same cannot be said about the Stap, which is piloted by Witten. Another CIS relic from the Clone Wars, the Stap was a single-person hover transport utilized by the Trade Federation's droid armies during their invasion of Naboo. Its pilot, Witten, may appear to be just a regular and unassuming Jawa, but in actuality, he's a warlord who runs a sandcrawler full of violent pirate Jawas. No, I'm not kidding. Witten is a barbaric and brutal Jawa who terrorized various moisture farms across Tatooine for years. His reputation earned him an invitation to Jabba's Demolition games where he was promised a brand new sandcrawler if he managed to win. One thing we know for sure is that he survived these games, as he's seen on board Jabba's barge shortly before it's destroyed by Luke Skywalker during the events of the 6th film. And of course we can't forget Malakili. You know, that big chunky human who seems to have a very strange connection to his repulsive Rancor as if it's his pet. That guy always creeped me out in the movie because I would watch him cry after his Rancor died and think he was a psycho. And he is, which is why he rides his pet Rancor into battle during the Demolition games. Once again, this is a character with a surprising amount of lore behind him in both continuities, more than I'm going to cover here, so I'll just say this. After Jabba died, he went on to form his own restaurant in Mos Eisley called the Crystal Moon with Jabba's previous cook. Bet you didn't know that, did you? As for his quote-unquote vehicle, the Rancor is just stupidly overpowered. Like, this thing, it's insane. You can just wreck your opposition with it. Also, Lobot is here for some reason. Oh, don't act like you don't know who Lobot is. I've actually mentioned in other videos how I love these cloud cars for some reason. Like, they give me some kind of feelings of nostalgia thinking about watching Empire Strikes Back as a kid. So getting to fly around in one is a welcome bit of gameplay for me. He doesn't get any cutscenes, nor do the remaining two characters I'm going to talk about, but the cloud car is a cool design, and it controls well. Can't ask for more than that. Although named in-game as the fierce bounty hunter Bosch, this character is actually just Leia Organa in disguise. We know this to be the case because of Lando's appearance, along with Carbonite Han, and when we see her appear in the twins cutscene helping them escape. She's fun enough to play as with the speeder bike, but it's clear she was a last-minute inclusion. Also, Bosch was a real character too, by the way. Yeah, he was an Ubies from Uba 4 until he took a job working for the Black Sun that went sideways and wound up as an alias for Leia to infiltrate Jabba's palace. And the last unlockable character is Darth Maul on his Sith speeder. No, I'm not going to give you any lore. He was dead when the Demolition games happened, and we all already know who he is. He is an awesome character to play as, though, and you can even use his double-bladed lightsaber as a weapon. I could be way off here, but I'm struggling to think of another game that lets us ride around on Maul's Sith speeder. I mean, the game might be worth trying for this inclusion alone. With the characters out of the way, let's talk a little bit about the available maps we'll be seeing during our time with the game. I can't say much about any of the specific maps since they all play about the same, but I'll point out what I think is the most unique thing about each one. Yeah, obviously we've got Tatooine. In fact, we have it twice. Once in the Dune Sea and once in Mos Eisley. The Dune Sea map features the Sarlacc pit, which is a pretty neat little addition since you can even be eaten by it, but it spits you right back out. For the Mos Eisley map, they opted to have these T-16s dock and create the ammo reload stations, but since they're constantly moving, the ammo comes and goes and you need to be quick to get it. Hoth has a couple of really cool additions, like AT-ATs moving around the map and firing off shots, Wampas throwing ice rocks at the player, and probe droids wandering around which can be destroyed in order to get a power-up, like an R2 unit for instance. The Naboo map has a giant playable board game. I mean, the map itself is pretty cool, and we can even see Theed out there in the distance, but this board game is the most notable part of the map. The Death Star 2 map, which is awesome by the way, features an active Death Star laser firing off every few seconds, which can totally eradicate you. Additionally, we even see a trench run portion where TIE fighters will frequently fly by and take some shots at you. I love this map. But unfortunately, this is one of two maps that does not show up in the tournament mode, so if you want to play this one, you'll have to go select it for one of the other modes. Then we've got Dagobah, which is, I mean, it's a big swamp with some massive trees. I didn't really like this map as it felt overly simplistic, and I feel like we could have done something more interesting than Dagobah. I wonder why the team felt restricted to movie planets like this. I would have preferred an Ord Mantell map or even a Kessel map or something. Dagobah just felt like grasping in my opinion. The Yavin 4 map isn't too bad since they made great use of the Massassi temples and even included this interesting boulder dynamic that can be used to crush your opponents. It's better than Dagobah, but I still don't love it. The Cloud City map on the other hand, I do love, so it's all the more unfortunate that it's another one locked behind the non-tournament game modes. This is the only other map you can only play on non-tournament game modes, which is honestly a strange decision to me. Be that as it may, I found this map to be a great choice for Hunt-A-Droid and ran multiple rounds of that on it. Across these maps, we can set forth and unleash carnage, or something to that effect. The gameplay we're given with which to do so is functional, but nothing to write home about. Anywhere from 2 to 5 vehicles are dropped into a map and pitted against each other to battle it out until only one remains. You have a meter for your shields, a meter for your health, and a meter for your ammunition. The key to the gameplay honestly comes down to trying to spend as few credits repairing your shields and refilling your ammo as possible. Your standard fire is going to be a typical blaster, but each vehicle will have a special attack that can be activated by holding down the fire button. And some of these attacks are far more devastating than others. No, seriously, this game is insanely unbalanced. Trying to play through it with different vehicles will quickly reveal to any reasonable person that the vehicles are totally unbalanced and some are quite simply far more powerful than others. I went from struggling to win to struggling to lose, literally depending on which character I was playing with. And that might be the game's single biggest fault. It's just a totally unbalanced experience. The only hope you have of evening the odds against stronger vehicles than you are to grab one of the various heavy weapon pickups like the tractor beam, thermal detonators, concussion missiles, and more. Even those won't actually do much to close the gap between the weaker vehicles and the stronger ones though. The game just doesn't really feel like it got enough good playtesting, and as a result, shipped in a sort of unfinished state. Which really sucks because I do see some genuine potential here for a great little Star Wars game. When all is said and done though, Star Wars Demolition is a host of potentially interesting ideas being weighed down by its lack of content and proper playtesting. The devs over at Lux of Flux really did get very close to something we could have called a great Star Wars game, but it still ended up totally missing the mark in my opinion. I do actually think Star Wars Demolition might be worth your time. Between the wildly unique concept, vehicle variety, and fun split-screen potential, I can really see this being a great time for you and a few friends who may share an interest in Star Wars to throw in an hour or two just having some fun with it. Outside of that scenario, however, I don't know that I'd ever recommend you giving it a shot. Its limited availability means it's not exactly easy to come by in any conventional way, and even if you did bother to get it set up and ready to go, then you would wind up being over it in just a couple of hours. If not from the lack of content, then from the unbalanced vehicles, which was a major point of criticism for the game upon release. The PS1 version of Demolition wound up with a Metacritic score of 63, with reviewers citing lack of replayability and a noticeable imbalance of the available vehicles as major issues. The Dreamcast did score a slightly better overall score of 67, but was still heavily criticized for roughly the same reasons. What we're left with is a respectable and ambitious attempt at adapting the Star Wars license into something edgier and more explosive than we'd ever really seen before in a video game, but one that still falls short not only of its own goals, but also of being a game worth really investing your time in to fall in love with in the first place. I enjoyed my time with Demolition, but I still don't think it's something I'd ever recommend to someone to try beyond a special occasion with some very like-minded friends. All in all, Star Wars Demolition is a bombastic entry into the universe that leaves little to no trace of its own existence after the initial flash of its own short-lived explosion has worn off.